In the aftermath of World War II left the Soviet Navy with a lot of ambitions, but very little with which to actually fulfill them. In terms of cruisers, there were a handful of Imperial Russian-era vessels that had been completed at various stages in the interwar period, the entirely unsatisfactory Kirovs, and a few Chapayev-class hulls that weren't entirely terrible, but also represented pre-war design considerations. These, plus one lonely Omaha class on loan and a couple of X-Axis war prizes, were the entire Soviet cruiser fleet. Given that Stalin wanted to have battleships, battlecruisers, and aircraft carriers, the Soviet Navy was in desperate need of some cruisers capable of actually escorting them, and so, in the interests of speed, the design teams decided to, in some ways, copy what the Americans had done with the Baltimore class, although of course they'd never admit it. Specifically, they decided to iterate on their previous design instead of developing an entirely new one. In this case, that was the Chapayevs, with the general aim of keeping roughly similar specifications for the headline, speed, protection, and firepower figures, while filling out the design with modern features such as radar and a comprehensive anti-aircraft battery. As it turned out, this resulted in adding about as much displacement as the Baltimores did relative to the Wichita, namely just over 3,000 tons. The resulting design, the Sverdlov class, or Project 68 BIS, the BIS signifying it being a derivative of the Chapayev's Project 68, would thus come in at about 13,230 tons standard displacement. The machinery, main battery, and armour were all the same as their predecessors, which meant that 110,000 shaft horsepower drove 2 screws, but with a reduced top speed of 33 knots due to the additional weight. The belt was only 100mm or 3.89 inches thick, with a 2-inch thick deck, and 175mm or 6.9 inches on the turret faces. The main battery, likewise, was the same dozen 6-inch 57 caliber B-38 model guns in 4 triple turrets, a pair super-firing forward and a pair super-firing aft, although the turrets were a little bit heavier and thus a fraction slower than their pre-war versions. However, improvements were made in other fields. The secondary battery was increased by 4 guns to a total of a dozen improved 100mm or 3.9-inch guns in 6 twin turrets, 3 per side, along with 32 37mm anti-aircraft guns in 16 twin mountings, plus a pair of quintuple torpedo launchers, 1 per side. Fuel capacity was increased for much greater range, and the hull was now welded instead of riveted. And although there wasn't space for a proper torpedo defence system, the hull and machinery were heavily subdivided into no less than 23 sections, all of which would require you to go up several decks, move across, and then come back down again if you wanted to move between them, as there were no doors or hatches between them below the armour deck. There were, of course, a slew of radars, including general surface and air search sets, and fire control radars for both the main and secondary batteries. The plan originally called for 30 ships to be built, but the advent of plans for the Stalingrad-class battlecruisers saw resources for 5 of the ships diverted to that project. Then Stalin died, and with him went the dream of a blue-water Soviet fleet that could challenge Western navies on the high seas. The order was therefore reduced to 21 ships, and of those, 14 would actually make it into the water. Interestingly, the 6 cancelled ships had been modified to include nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare protection measures, which those that actually entered service earlier didn't have. The launch and commissioning of a large number of modern cruisers by the Soviets would in part dictate quite a lot of early NATO naval force structure decisions. The US Navy and Royal Navy, for example, would retain a number of gun cruisers of their own, and, at least in the 1950s, active battleships, in a mixture of active service and ready reserve, specifically to counter the Soviet cruiser swarm. On top of that, an awful lot of research went into the development of both aircraft and weapons that just so happened to have standoff ranges that would allow them to attack a Sverdlov from just outside their defensive gun range. However, despite the numbers of the class, they were split between the Northern, Baltic, Black Sea and Pacific fleets, and so there were never more than a handful in any given theatre. The late 1950s also saw a number being renamed or considered for renaming to avoid further association with Stalin's regime. However, with the dawn of the missile age, the need to adapt to these ships was seen, and the Admiral Nakhimov had her forward turrets replaced by a launcher for a truly massive anti-shipping missile. However, the missile was quickly rendered obsolete, and the sheer size of it and the launcher made it an impractical proposition anyway, which saw the ship actually taken out of service in 1961 and used as a target, ironically enough, for other more modern anti-shipping missiles instead. Various other attempts to improve the ships were made, many focusing on replacing the aft superfiring turret with some sort of missile launcher. The Dzerzhinsky had an adapted SA-2 launcher placed there, and the Zhdanov and Admiral Senyavin had an SAN-4 missile launcher placed there instead, along with 4 twin 30mm AK-230 Gatling gun CIWS type mounts. Then, partway through, they changed their minds, and the Senyavin also lost the other aft turret with the space filled by a helicopter hangar and another 4 AK-230s. So yeah, that's 8 twin 30mm Gatlings, and a slightly unclear number of other ships had updated radar suites installed along with 8 twin AK-230s, replacing some of the twin 37mm installations. But with a limited capacity for self-defense against modern anti-shipping weapons, the 1980s would gradually see the surviving members of the class taken out of service. With the exception of the Orjonikidze, which had been sold to Indonesia in the 1960s and scrapped in the 1970s, the ships that remained in Soviet hands were then gradually sent to the breakers over the course of the latter part of the 1980s and early 1990s, except for the Mikhail Kutuzov, which remains as a museum ship in the Black Sea.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.